Eleanor Whitehorse's coffee cup slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor as the masked intruder stepped through her front door. She'd thought she was alone in the sprawling Colorado ranch house, 73 years old, widowed, forgotten by a world that no longer needed her. The black-clad figure wasn't supposed to be there. A low, guttural growl erupted from the sliding glass door behind him, and Eleanor watched in frozen disbelief as Sierra, the wild bobcat she'd been secretly caring for, launched herself through the opening with lethal precision. 30 pounds of fury and protective instinct collided with the intruder, sending him crashing into the doorframe. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as childhood memories of her grandmother's stories flooded back, tales of animal spirits protecting those who showed kindness. "Call 911," she gasped to no one, her voice barely a whisper. But what terrified her most wasn't the violent struggle unfolding in her living room. It was the realization that this savage confrontation would expose the secret that could destroy everything she'd come to love. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 8 months had carved deep lines around Eleanor Whitehorse's eyes, each one a testament to sleepless nights spent rattling around in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The ranch-style dwelling in the Colorado foothills had once echoed with Joseph's booming laugh and the comfortable chaos of family life, but now it held only the weight of silence and the ghost of conversations that would never come again. At 73, Eleanor found herself caught between two worlds, too proud to burden her children, too lonely to pretend she was fine. Sarah called every Tuesday from Seattle, her voice bright with forced cheer as she updated her mother on the grandchildren Eleanor rarely saw. Michael managed a Sunday check-in from Boston between his law practice and his new wife's social calendar. They meant well, but their lives had moved on while hers remained frozen in the amber of grief. "Nobody needs me anymore," she whispered to Joseph's photograph each morning, the words becoming a bitter ritual. The man in the silver frame smiled back with the same warm eyes that had captured her heart 50 years ago, but even his memory felt distant now, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The financial reality pressed against her chest like a stone. Joseph's pension barely covered the mortgage on their dream home, and the medical bills from his final months had devoured their savings with ruthless efficiency. The assisted living brochures Sarah had helpfully sent lay unopened on the kitchen counter, colorful promises of community and care that felt more like surrender than solution. Eleanor's own dreams had been buried alongside her husband. She'd always wanted to be a wildlife photographer, to capture the raw beauty of Colorado's creatures through her own lens. But Joseph had gently discouraged such dangerous nonsense. A lady's place was in supporting her husband's career, not chasing wild animals through the mountains. Now his expensive camera equipment gathered dust in the closet, a monument to opportunities missed and talents unexplored. The house itself seemed to mock her with its vastness. 4 bedrooms for 2 people who'd never had children of their own, a kitchen designed for hosting dinner parties they'd stopped throwing years ago, and a basement darkroom that Joseph had declared off-limits, his private sanctuary for developing the nature photographs that had made him locally famous. She'd respected his boundaries then, but now those locked doors felt like secrets that would die with their keeper. Sometimes she stood at the top of the basement stairs, key in hand, wondering what mysteries lay behind Joseph's carefully guarded professional life. But respect for the dead ran deeper than curiosity, and she always turned away. Morning coffee had become Eleanor's anchor, the one constant in days that stretched endlessly toward bedtime. She'd sit at the kitchen window overlooking the back deck Joseph had built for their 35th anniversary, watching squirrels raid the bird feeder and counting the hours until darkness brought the mercy of sleep. The deck railing bore the scars of countless Colorado winters, its weathered wood a mirror of her own weathered hope. This was survival, not living, and Eleanor Whitehorse was tired of merely surviving. March arrived with the kind of tentative warmth that made Colorado natives cautious. Winter's retreat was never guaranteed, and hope could be crushed by a late-season blizzard. Eleanor sat at her kitchen window with her morning coffee, steam fogging the glass as she gazed at the empty bird feeder Joseph had installed their first spring in the house. The cardinals and blue jays had abandoned it weeks ago, leaving only the occasional squirrel to remind her that life continued its relentless march forward. Movement in the backyard caught her eye. Not the usual scurrying of rodents, but something larger, more deliberate. Eleanor set down her mug and leaned closer to the window, her breath catching as a magnificent creature emerged from behind the garden shed. A bobcat, easily 30 pounds, with distinctive black-tipped ears and the characteristic stubby tail that gave the species its name, moved through the dormant flower beds with fluid grace. The wildcat was beautiful in a way that made Eleanor's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Her tawny coat was marked with dark spots and bars, perfectly designed for blending into the dappled shadows of the Colorado foothills. But what struck Eleanor most was the cat's behavior. Instead of passing through like the occasional deer or elk she'd glimpsed over the years, this bobcat seemed to be settling in. Eleanor watched, transfixed, as the female bobcat began gathering dried grasses and small branches. The cat's sides showed the telltale roundness of pregnancy, and late winter was indeed birthing season for these remarkable creatures. She was making a den beneath the raised deck Joseph had built for their 35th anniversary, the same deck where they'd spent countless summer evenings watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Well, I'll be," Eleanor whispered, her breath fogging the glass again. Her first instinct might have been fear. Mountain lions and bears occasionally wandered into residential areas, after all, but this felt different. This wasn't aggression or invasion. This was a mother-to-be seeking shelter, and something deep in Eleanor's own maternal instincts recognized the universal need for safety. She reached for Joseph's old Nikon camera on the shelf, the one he'd used during their hiking days before his knees gave out, and his interest shifted to other pursuits. The weight of it in her hands brought a bittersweet pang, but also comfort. Joseph would have been thrilled by this visitor, would have spent hours documenting every movement, every behavior. Over the following days, Eleanor established a routine that gave her mornings purpose for the first time in months. She'd position herself at the kitchen window with her coffee and Joseph's camera, maintaining a respectful distance while documenting her unusual tenant. The bobcat, which Eleanor had begun thinking of as Sierra in her mind, a name that seemed to fit the cat's regal bearing, appeared to accept this arrangement. Wild animals, Eleanor knew from nature documentaries, could sense intent. Sierra seemed to understand that the elderly woman watching from behind glass posed no threat. The photographs became Eleanor's new obsession, her reason to rise each morning with anticipation instead of dread. She learned Sierra's patterns: early morning stretches in the weak spring sun, late afternoon grooming sessions, the careful way she'd slip away at dusk to hunt. Eleanor never saw the kills, but sometimes Sierra would return with evidence of success, a satisfied air about her as she settled into her den, the occasional tuft of rabbit fur caught on her whiskers. "You'd love this, Joseph," Eleanor would murmur, reviewing the day's photos on the camera's small screen. It became a way of including him, of feeling less alone in the vast house that had become more prison than home. The presence of wildlife, life creating more life in her backyard, felt like a blessing, a reminder that the world continued its ancient rhythms despite personal loss. Eleanor was careful to maintain boundaries, never attempting to feed Sierra or approach the den. This was observation, not interaction, a privilege to witness, not possess. 3 weeks later, on a brilliant April morning that made the mountains look close enough to touch, Eleanor's vigil was rewarded beyond her wildest hopes. Movement under the deck caught her eye, and she raised the camera with hands that trembled from excitement rather than age. Sierra emerged first, moving carefully, and behind her came two tiny forms stumbling on oversized paws. Bobcat kittens, perhaps 3 weeks old, their eyes newly opened to the world. They were perfect miniatures of their mother, spotted and stubby-tailed, tumbling over each other as they explored the few feet around the den. Sierra watched them with the universal patience of mothers everywhere, occasionally nudging one back when it wandered too far. "Oh, Joseph," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face as she captured frame after frame. "Look at them. Just look at them." For the first time since the funeral, Eleanor Whitehorse felt truly alive. She had a family to watch over again, even if they would never know her name. The shrill ring of Eleanor's landline shattered the peaceful July morning, causing her to nearly drop Joseph's camera as she documented Sierra's kittens playing in the dappled sunlight. She'd been so absorbed in watching the larger kitten, Brave, as she'd privately named him, attempt his first real pounce that the outside world had ceased to exist. "Mrs. Whitehorse, this is Animal Control. We've received reports of a large predator in your neighborhood." The voice was crisp, official, and sent ice through Eleanor's veins. "We need to schedule an inspection of your property." Eleanor's mouth went dry. What kind of reports?" "Bobcat sighting, possibly with young. These animals can be extremely dangerous, especially mothers with cubs. We'll need access to your backyard to assess the situation and relocate if necessary." The word relocate hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She knew what that meant. Sierra and her babies, torn from their safe haven, transported miles away to unfamiliar territory where survival was uncertain at best. "When would you need to come?" "Tomorrow morning, 8 sharp. Please ensure all pets are secured indoors." After hanging up, Eleanor sank into her kitchen chair, staring out at the den where Sierra was nursing her kittens in blissful ignorance of the threat approaching. 24 hours. That's all the time she had to say goodbye to the family that had given her life meaning again. But as evening approached, fate delivered a cruel twist that would test everything Eleanor thought she knew about survival and sacrifice. The territorial fight erupted just after sunset, when the mountains were painted in shades of purple and gold. Eleanor heard it first, the bone-chilling screams and snarls of wild cats in combat echoing from the ravine behind her property. She rushed to the window in time to see Sierra limping into view, her usually graceful gait replaced by an awkward stumble. Blood. Dark stains matted the fur on Sierra's right shoulder and foreleg, and even from the kitchen window Eleanor could see the cat was in serious distress. A larger male bobcat, probably the territorial dispute that wildlife experts always warned about, had challenged Sierra's claim to the area. Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for her phone, but then reality crashed over her like ice water. If she called Animal Control now, they'd arrive to find an injured wild animal and her kittens. The bureaucratic response would be swift and merciless. Sierra would be either euthanized as a public safety risk, or, if she survived treatment, relocated anyway. The kittens, too young to survive without their mother, would likely be put down as unadoptable wildlife. The official Animal Control office had closed at 5. The emergency line would route her to the sheriff's department, who would probably shoot Sierra as a precaution. Eleanor stood frozen in her kitchen, watching Sierra collapse near the den entrance, her breathing labored and visible even from this distance. 20 minutes passed. Sierra hadn't moved except for the rise and fall of her rib cage. The kittens emerged from the den, mewing pitifully as they nuzzled their motionless mother, seeking warmth and milk that might never come again. "Damn it, Joseph," Eleanor whispered to his photograph. "What would you do?" But she already knew the answer. Joseph had been a man of action, someone who believed in doing what was right, regardless of consequences. Eleanor pulled on her thickest gardening gloves and grabbed the first aid kit from the bathroom cabinet, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stepped onto the back deck. The evening air carried the metallic scent of blood and the musk of wild animals. Sierra's golden eyes tracked Eleanor's approach, pupils dilated with pain and stress. The wound was worse up close, a ragged tear perhaps 4 inches long that had bled significantly. Eleanor could see Sierra's rib cage rising and falling too rapidly, indicating shock. "Easy, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly, kneeling 3 feet away from 30 pounds of wounded predator. "I know you're hurting, but you've got babies to think about." Sierra growled low, a warning that sent primal fear shooting through Eleanor's nervous system. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to call the authorities, to let nature take its course. But the kittens mewed again from the den, and Eleanor thought of all the times she'd felt helpless, all the moments when she'd needed someone to take a risk for her. Moving with deliberate slowness, she extended a folded towel toward the wound. Sierra's growl intensified, but exhaustion and blood loss had weakened her usual lightning reflexes. "I know it hurts," Eleanor murmured, "but I'm not your enemy. I've been watching over you all these weeks." Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was desperation. But Sierra's growl faded to a whimper, and she allowed Eleanor to press the towel gently against the wound. For 10 minutes that felt like hours, Eleanor maintained pressure while murmuring the same nonsense comfort words she'd used when Sarah and Michael were children with scraped knees. The bleeding slowed, then stopped, but Sierra looked worse, panting now, tongue slightly protruding, clearly dehydrated from blood loss. Eleanor fetched a shallow dish of water, watching as Sierra lapped weakly at it, managing perhaps a tablespoon before losing interest. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Eleanor made a decision that would have shocked her children and horrified animal control. She arranged several old blankets around Sierra's position, creating a windbreak. She set up a camping lantern on low setting, enough light to monitor Sierra's condition without attracting attention from neighbors. Then she settled into a lawn chair beside the den, Joseph's camera across her lap, prepared to maintain an all-night vigil. "If you're going to die," she told Sierra quietly, "you're not dying alone. And if you're going to live, I'm going to make sure you have the chance." The night stretched endlessly ahead, filled with the sounds of Sierra's labored breathing and the occasional mew from the kittens. Eleanor checked her watch. 10 hours until animal control arrived. 10 hours to either witness a miracle or say goodbye to the family she'd never expected to love. By 3 in the morning, Sierra had managed to shift position and was attempting to groom her uninjured shoulder, a positive sign that gave Eleanor the first flutter of hope. Wild animals, she'd read somewhere, only groomed themselves when they felt safe and were focusing on healing rather than survival. As dawn approached, painting the mountains in soft pastels, Sierra lifted her head and looked directly at Eleanor. Those golden eyes held something that might have been recognition, maybe even gratitude. Eleanor raised the camera one more time, capturing what she somehow knew would be their last quiet moment together. In 3 hours, everything would change. The morning sun painted Eleanor's kitchen in golden hues as she prepared what had become her sacred ritual: coffee, camera, and quiet observation of the family that had transformed her world. Sierra had recovered remarkably over the past month, the wound healing into a thin pink scar that was barely visible beneath her thick summer coat. The kittens, now nearly 3 months old, had grown into miniature versions of their mother, all gangly legs and oversized ears that they would eventually grow into. Eleanor had documented every milestone, their first tentative steps beyond the den, their clumsy attempts at stalking grasshoppers, the day Brave successfully caught his first mouse while Careful hung back, observing before attempting the same feat. The photographs filled memory cards and her heart in equal measure, giving her a purpose she hadn't felt since Joseph's death. But beneath this newfound joy lurked a constant undercurrent of anxiety. She'd managed to deflect the animal control visit with a carefully crafted lie about mistaken identity. The neighbor's large tabby cat had been the culprit, she'd claimed, and showed them photos of the orange tomcat from 2 houses down. The officer had seemed skeptical but had no evidence to contradict her story. The real problem was her growing attachment to creatures that belonged in the wild, not in her suburban backyard. Eleanor knew she was walking a dangerous line between observation and interference, but every day made it harder to maintain that boundary. When Sierra had brought the kittens a wounded rabbit to practice their hunting skills, Eleanor had watched through tears, understanding this was nature's harsh curriculum, but wishing she could spare them the brutality. "You're getting too involved," she told herself daily, but the words felt hollow. How could she not be involved when she'd helped save Sierra's life? When the Bobcat mother had chosen her deck as a safe haven, when those golden eyes looked at her with what seemed like recognition and trust, the financial pressure hadn't eased either. The assisted living brochures still sat on her counter, joined now by overdue bills and stern notices from the mortgage company. Sarah's weekly calls had become more insistent about making practical decisions, while Michael had suggested she downsize to something manageable. Neither understood that leaving this house would mean abandoning Sierra and the kittens to an uncertain fate. It was during one of these contemplative mornings that Eleanor first noticed him. A man in a dark sedan parked across the street, seemingly absorbed in a newspaper but never turning the pages. The same car appeared 3 days in a row, always between 8 and 10 in the morning, always with the same occupant. When she mentioned it to her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, during their brief fence-line conversation about property taxes, the older woman's response chilled her. "Oh, that's been going on for weeks, dear. I thought maybe he was some kind of investigator. You know how they watch houses sometimes when they suspect activities?" Activities. The word hung between them like a loaded accusation. Eleanor's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. Someone was watching her, documenting her routines, and possibly building a case for something she couldn't yet fathom. That evening, as she was uploading the day's photographs to her laptop, Eleanor made a discovery that would shatter her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her late husband. While organizing files, she accidentally clicked on a folder labeled JW Archives, Joseph's initials. It required a password, something she'd never encountered before on their shared computer. On impulse, she tried Sierra's birthday, the day the Bobcat had first appeared. To her shock, the folder opened, revealing hundreds of files that made her stomach lurch with recognition and revulsion: wildlife trafficking records, bills of sale for exotic animals, correspondence with buyers in Texas and Nevada, and photographs, not the nature photography Joseph had been known for, but documentation of caged wildcats, including several bobcats with numbered ear tags. Eleanor's hands trembled as she scrolled through what appeared to be years of illegal activity. Joseph hadn't been the nature-loving photographer she'd believed him to be. He'd been trafficking in the very creatures she'd thought he admired, selling them to private collectors and hunting preserves where they'd face certain death. One photograph stopped her cold. A young bobcat in a transport cage, clearly pregnant, with a distinctive scar on her front left paw. The same scar Sierra bore. The timestamp showed the photo was taken just 3 days before Joseph's sudden heart attack 8 months ago. Eleanor sank into her chair as the horrifying truth crystallized. Sierra hadn't chosen her backyard randomly. She'd escaped from Joseph's operation and had been living wild in the mountains for months before pregnancy and instinct drove her to seek shelter. The irony was devastating. Eleanor had been caring for the very creature her husband had planned to sell, the widow unknowingly harboring evidence of her husband's crimes. Sleep became impossible that night. Eleanor paced the house, alternately staring at the incriminating files and watching Sierra nurse her kittens under the deck. Every happy memory of her marriage felt tainted now, every nature hike and photography expedition reframed as scouting trips for Joseph's illegal enterprise. How many times had he returned from those trips with stories of wildlife encounters while actually documenting animals he planned to capture and sell? The morning brought another shock. The mysterious watcher was back, but this time he got out of his car and approached her front door. Through the peephole, Eleanor saw a tall man in his 30s with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held the flat hardness of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I'm Marcus Thornfield." He showed her a badge, not police but some kind of private investigator's license. "I need to speak with you about your late husband's activities and a certain bobcat that's been spotted on your property." Eleanor's world tilted dangerously. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading without even knowing she should dread it. But some survival instinct made her keep the chain latched and speak through the crack. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Mrs. Whitehorse, I have surveillance photos of you providing care to a wild bobcat. That's a federal crime. But more importantly, that particular animal killed my father 2 years ago during an escape from your husband's trafficking operation. I'm here to collect what's mine and see that justice is finally served." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. Marcus Thornfield wasn't just an investigator. He was the son of someone involved in Joseph's crimes, someone seeking revenge against the creature that had taken his father's life in what was probably a desperate bid for freedom. "I don't have to talk to you," Eleanor managed, her voice steadier than her hands. "No, ma'am, you don't. But the federal wildlife agents I'm working with will be here tomorrow morning with warrants. That bobcat and her offspring are evidence in an ongoing investigation. They'll be confiscated and most likely euthanized as dangerous animals with a history of human aggression." Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples. Through the kitchen window she could see Sierra teaching Brave how to climb the oak tree, the patient mother guiding her son's paws to the strongest branches. Neither of them knew that their world was about to end, that the sanctuary they'd found would become their prison. That afternoon, Eleanor made a decision that went against every law-abiding instinct she'd cultivated over 73 years. She began researching wildlife sanctuaries in neighboring states, looking for facilities that might take in Sierra and the kittens without asking too many questions about their origins. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was planning to traffic the same animals her husband had stolen, but this time toward freedom rather than captivity. The logistics seemed impossible. How could an elderly woman transport 3 wild bobcats across state lines without proper permits or veterinary certificates? How could she ensure they'd end up somewhere safe rather than sold to the same kind of buyers Joseph had dealt with? As evening approached, Eleanor sat on her back deck, perhaps for the last time as a free woman. Sierra emerged from the den and, in an unprecedented display of trust, approached to within 10 feet of Eleanor's chair. For a long moment, the two mothers regarded each other across the species divide, both sensing that change was coming but unable to communicate the depth of their mutual understanding. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered. I tried to protect you, but I think I've only made things worse." Sierra tilted her head, those golden eyes reflecting the setting sun, and Eleanor could have sworn she saw forgiveness in their depths. Or maybe it was just the desperate projection of a woman who'd discovered that love and good intentions weren't always enough to shield the innocent from the consequences of other people's sins. The phone rang inside the house, probably Sarah with her weekly check-in, ready to deliver another lecture about facing reality. Eleanor ignored it, choosing instead to memorize this moment when peace still existed in her small corner of the world. Tomorrow would bring federal agents and the end of everything she'd come to treasure. But tonight belonged to her and Sierra and the soft sounds of kittens learning to be wild. The morning sun felt different on Eleanor's face as she stood at her kitchen window, knowing it might be her last peaceful moment before everything collapsed. The federal agents Marcus had threatened would arrive soon, and she'd spent a sleepless night alternating between paralyzing fear and desperate planning. Sierra and her kittens were still blissfully unaware, playing their morning games beneath the deck where sunlight filtered through the wooden slats in golden bars, an ironic preview of the cages that awaited them. Eleanor had made her choice during the darkest hours before dawn. She wouldn't let them be taken without a fight, regardless of the consequences to herself. At 73, what did she have left to lose? Her reputation was already ruined by Joseph's crimes, her financial security was a joke, and her children saw her as a burden anyway. But Sierra and those kittens, they had everything to lose, and they'd never chosen to be part of Joseph's criminal enterprise. The sound of car doors slamming in her driveway sent ice through Eleanor's veins. Through the front window, she watched 3 vehicles disgorge a small army of officials. Marcus Thornfield, looking grimly satisfied, 2 men in Fish and Wildlife Service uniforms carrying tranquilizer equipment, and a woman with "Federal Agent" written in her posture and expression. Eleanor's hands shook as she poured herself another cup of coffee, using the familiar ritual to steady her nerves. The doorbell's aggressive ring echoed through the house like a death knell, but she took her time walking to the front door, using every second to prepare for the performance of her life. "Mrs. Whitehorse," the federal agent said, showing her badge. "Agent Rebecca Stonecrow, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have warrants to search your property for illegally harbored wildlife and evidence related to your late husband's trafficking operation." Eleanor examined the papers with the thoroughness of someone who had nothing left to rush toward. "These seem to be in order," she said finally, though her legal knowledge extended no further than what she'd learned from television dramas. "Though I should mention that I've already contacted my attorney." It was a lie. She couldn't afford an attorney, but it had the desired effect. Agent Stonecrow's confident expression flickered slightly. "That's your right, ma'am. However, we'll proceed with the search as authorized. Mr. Thornfield here has provided us with surveillance evidence of your interactions with the animals in question." Marcus stepped forward, his gray eyes cold as winter stones. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I want you to understand something. That bobcat out there killed my father when he was trying to recapture her 2 years ago. She's not some innocent wild animal, she's a killer that's been evading justice. Today that ends." Eleanor studied Marcus's face, seeing something beyond grief and anger, an obsession that had consumed years of his life. "Your father," she said slowly, "was he involved in my husband's business? My father was a professional animal handler who died trying to contain an animal that never should have been allowed to breed in the first place. He was trying to correct Joseph's mistake when that creature attacked him." The euphemisms were telling. Animal handler, professional, mistake. Eleanor felt a flicker of her old teaching instincts kicking in. She'd spent 30 years recognizing when students were trying to rewrite history to avoid uncomfortable truths. "I see," she said simply, stepping aside to let them enter. "The backyard is through the kitchen." As the team moved through her house with practiced efficiency, Eleanor found herself walking a strange tightrope between cooperation and subtle obstruction. She answered their questions honestly, but volunteered nothing extra. Yes, she'd observed bobcats on her property. No, she hadn't fed them directly. Yes, she'd taken photographs for her own interest in wildlife. Agent Stonecrow paused at the kitchen window, studying the deck area through binoculars. There, under the far end of the deck, I can see movement. Looks like an adult female and at least 2 juveniles. Eleanor's heart clenched as she watched the agents deploy their equipment. The tranquilizer guns looked absurdly large and clinical, designed for efficiency rather than compassion. Marcus supervised with the intensity of someone finally approaching a long-sought goal, his hands clenched into fists as he watched the wildlife officers prepare their approach. Mrs. "White Horse," Agent Stonecrow said, "I need you to remain inside while we secure the animals, for your safety and ours." But Eleanor had no intention of hiding while Sierra and her family faced capture. "This is my property," she said firmly. "I'm going to watch from the deck to ensure no unnecessary harm comes to them." The agent's expression suggested she'd rather lock Eleanor in a closet, but constitutional rights apparently extended even to accomplices in wildlife trafficking. "Stay well back and follow our instructions immediately if we tell you to move." Eleanor positioned herself at the deck railing, close enough to see everything but far enough to avoid interfering with the operation. Below, Sierra had sensed danger. The bobcat mother was no longer lounging in the morning sun but crouched in the deep shadows beneath the deck, her golden eyes scanning for threats while her kittens pressed against her sides. "She knows," Marcus said with satisfaction. "Look at that posture. That's an animal ready to fight. Same way she looked at my father right before she killed him." Eleanor wanted to argue, to point out that Sierra was simply a mother protecting her young, but she bit her tongue. Any defense of the bobcat would only reinforce their perception of her as an accomplice rather than an innocent widow caught up in her husband's crimes. The wildlife officers moved with professional caution, one positioning himself at each end of the deck while Agent Stonecrow approached from the side. They'd done this before. Eleanor could see it in their coordinated movements, their calm communication, their assumption that this would proceed according to established protocol. They hadn't counted on Sierra's intelligence. As the first officer aimed his tranquilizer gun, Sierra made a decision that shattered Eleanor's heart. The bobcat mother nudged her kittens deeper into the shadows, then deliberately moved away from them, drawing the human's attention toward the opposite end of the deck. She was sacrificing herself to give her children a chance to escape. "She's moving toward the tree line," Agent Stonecrow called out. "Tom, cut her off at the oak tree. Marcus, stay back. Let us handle this." But Marcus wasn't listening. Years of obsession had brought him to this moment, and he pulled out a pistol that Eleanor was certain wasn't standard equipment for federal wildlife operations. "No tranquilizers," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone freeze. "That animal doesn't deserve the courtesy of a peaceful capture." "Mr. Thornfield," Agent Stonecrow's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Put the weapon away immediately. This is a federal operation, not a personal vendetta. My father died because people like you treat these killers like pets instead of the dangerous predators they are. I'm not letting her slip away again." Eleanor watched in horror as Marcus raised the pistol, his hands steady with the confidence of someone who'd practiced this moment in his mind countless times. Sierra was perhaps 20 feet away, still moving deliberately to draw attention from her hidden kittens, unaware that her sacrifice was about to become meaningless. Time seemed to slow as Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. At 73, arthritic and out of shape, she vaulted over the deck railing with a grace born of desperation, landing hard on the ground between Marcus and Sierra. "No!" she screamed, spreading her arms wide to shield the bobcat. "You want to shoot something, you shoot me first!" The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds that felt like hours. Marcus's gun remained trained on Eleanor while Sierra crouched behind her, the unlikely alliance between elderly widow and wild predator creating a tableau that would burn itself into everyone's memory. Agent Stonecrow's voice cut through the tension with professional authority. "Everyone lower your weapons now. Mr. Thornfield, you're in violation of federal law and about 3 seconds away from being arrested." But Eleanor barely heard the argument erupting around her. Her attention was focused on the soft sound of movement behind her as Sierra's kittens emerged from their hiding place, drawn by their mother's distress calls. All three of them were together now, the family complete and vulnerable, depending on a 73-year-old woman to stand between them and whatever justice Marcus Thornfield thought he was delivering. The crack of Marcus's pistol shattered the morning stillness, and Eleanor felt something wet and warm splash across her face before she understood what had happened. Sierra's agonized yowl pierced the air as the bobcat stumbled, crimson spreading across her golden fur like spilled paint on canvas. The bullet had caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around before she collapsed against the deck's foundation. "Sierra!" Eleanor's voice broke as she dropped to her knees beside the wounded animal, her hands hovering uselessly over the injury. Blood, so much blood, soaked into the earth beneath them, while Sierra's breath came in rapid, shallow pants that Eleanor recognized from Joseph's final days. The kittens mewed in confusion and terror, pressing against their mother's uninjured side, as if their small bodies could somehow hold her together. "You shot her," Eleanor whispered, then screamed it. "You shot her in front of her babies!" Marcus lowered his weapon, his face pale but resolute. "She's been living on borrowed time. My father deserved justice, and now he has it." Agent Stonecrow was shouting into her radio, something about medical emergency and veterinary support, but Eleanor barely heard her over the sound of Sierra's labored breathing. The bobcat's golden eyes, usually so alert and aware, were growing glassy with shock. Eleanor had seen that look before, during the endless hours spent watching Joseph slip away in the hospital. "No, no, no," Eleanor murmured, finally placing her hands on Sierra's heaving side. "You don't get to die. Not like this. Not in front of your children." Through her tears, Eleanor became dimly aware of the chaos erupting around her. Agent Stonecrow was placing Marcus under arrest, her voice sharp with professional fury as she recited his rights. The wildlife officers were trying to assess Sierra's condition while maintaining a safe distance from Eleanor, who refused to move away from the injured bobcat. "Ma'am, we need to get the animal to a veterinary facility immediately," one of the officers said. "Please step back so we can—" "She'll die if you move her," Eleanor said flatly. "Look at her. She's going into shock." The officer, Tom, she thought she'd heard Agent Stonecrow call him, knelt beside Eleanor with surprising gentleness. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I understand your attachment, but this animal needs professional medical care. We have a wildlife veterinarian standing by." Eleanor looked at Sierra's kittens, huddled together and mewing pitifully as they tried to nurse from their unconscious mother. They were perhaps 4 months old, old enough to survive without milk, but too young to hunt effectively on their own. In the wild, they would slowly starve without Sierra's protection and teaching. "What happens to them?" Eleanor asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken aloud. Tom's silence said everything. Orphaned bobcat kittens couldn't be released into the wild without their mother's training, and they couldn't be kept in captivity because federal law prohibited the private ownership of wild animals. The kittens would be euthanized as non-releasable wildlife, a clinical term for creatures whose only crime was being born into circumstances beyond their control. 20 minutes, Eleanor said suddenly. "Give me 20 minutes with her before you take them." Agent Stonecrow, who had finished securing Marcus in one of the vehicles, approached with the weary expression of someone dealing with complications she hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Whitehorse, I sympathize with your situation, but this is an active federal investigation. These animals are evidence. Evidence of what? That my husband was a criminal? That I was stupid enough to think love could fix what he broke? Eleanor's voice cracked as Sierra's breathing became more labored. You want your evidence? There's a whole computer full of files inside that'll give you everything you need to prosecute Joseph Whitehorse posthumously, but these animals, they're not evidence. They're victims. The federal agent studied Eleanor's face for a long moment, perhaps recognizing something of herself in the older woman's fierce protectiveness. 10 minutes, she said finally. Then we have to move her. Eleanor nodded gratefully, then turned her attention back to Sierra. The bobcat's eyes had closed, but her chest still rose and fell with the irregular rhythm of someone fighting to stay alive. Eleanor had watched this same battle in hospital rooms and understood the signs. Sierra was dying, probably from internal bleeding that no amount of veterinary intervention could stop. I'm sorry, Eleanor whispered, stroking Sierra's uninjured side with trembling fingers. I'm so sorry this happened to you. You trusted me and I couldn't protect you. One of the kittens, brave, she was sure it was brave, approached Eleanor's hand and rubbed against her fingers with the innocent affection of a creature too young to understand death. The simple gesture broke something inside Eleanor's chest, and she found herself sobbing openly for the first time since Joseph's funeral. You're good babies, she told the kittens through her tears. Your mama taught you to be brave and smart and careful. She loved you so much, and she fought so hard to keep you safe. Sierra's breathing changed, becoming shallower and more erratic. Eleanor had heard this sound before, the body's final attempt to hold on to life before surrendering to whatever came next. She leaned closer to Sierra's ear, close enough to smell the wild scent of pine and mountain air that clung to her fur. Go if you need to go, Eleanor whispered. Your babies will be okay. I promise you, somehow, they'll be okay. As if she'd been waiting for permission, Sierra's breathing stopped. The sudden stillness was absolute, as if the entire universe had paused to acknowledge the passing of a creature who had asked for nothing more than the chance to raise her children in peace. Eleanor sat back on her heels, still crying but no longer sobbing. Around her, the federal agents and wildlife officers maintained respectful silence, while the kittens continued their futile attempts to wake their mother. They didn't understand that the warm body they nuzzled would never respond again, that the source of their safety and sustenance had been extinguished by a man's need for revenge. Mrs. Whitehorse, Agent Stonecrow said softly, we need to collect the body and the juveniles now. Eleanor looked up at the federal agent, her face streaked with tears and Sierra's blood. Where will you take them? The kittens will be transported to a facility in Denver for evaluation. If they can't be rehabilitated for release, they'll be killed, Eleanor finished. Just say it. They'll be killed because there's no room in your system for orphaned babies whose only crime was having a mother who wanted them to be free. Agent Stonecrow's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been sympathy. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitehorse, I truly am. But federal regulations are clear about the disposition of non-releasable wildlife. Eleanor stood slowly, her arthritic knees protesting after kneeling on the hard ground. She looked at Marcus, secured in the back of the federal vehicle, his face turned away from the scene he'd created. Then she looked at the kittens, still trying to nurse from their dead mother, still believing that persistence might bring her back. You know what the worst part is? Eleanor said to no one in particular. Sierra spent her whole life trying to escape from humans who wanted to cage her or kill her, and in the end, the only human who wanted to protect her couldn't even do that. As the wildlife officers began the process of removing Sierra's body and capturing the kittens, Eleanor walked back toward her house with the slow, unsteady gait of someone who had aged years in the space of hours. Behind her, she could hear the confused cries of the kittens as they were separated from their mother for the last time. At 73 years old, Eleanor Whitehorse had just watched everything she'd come to love die in her backyard, and she couldn't see any reason to believe that tomorrow would bring anything but more loss. Eleanor sat in her kitchen 3 hours later, staring at the blood-stained deck through her window while Agent Stonecrow finished photographing Joseph's computer files. The house felt hollow now, emptied of the purpose that had sustained her through the worst months of her grief. Without Sierra and the kittens to watch over, the silence pressed against her eardrums like deep water. "Mrs. Whitehorse," Agent Stonecrow said, settling into the chair across from Eleanor with the careful movements of someone delivering difficult news. "I need you to understand the scope of what we've discovered here. Your husband's operation was much larger than we initially believed." Eleanor forced herself to focus on the agent's words, though part of her mind remained fixed on the image of Sierra's kittens crying for their mother. "How much larger?" Based on these files, Joseph was trafficking between 30 and 50 animals per year across state lines: bobcats, lynx, foxes, even a few wolves. The buyers were private collectors, hunting preserves, and what they call exotic entertainment facilities. Agent Stonecrow's voice carried professional neutrality, but Eleanor caught the undertone of disgust. "This wasn't a small-time operation, ma'am. This was organized crime." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. 50 animals per year. For how many years? She thought of all Joseph's photography trips, all his unexplained absences, all the times he'd returned home with stories about wildlife encounters that now seemed like grotesque jokes. "There's something else," Agent Stonecrow continued. "Marcus Thornfield's father, David Thornfield, wasn't just an animal handler, as Marcus believed. According to these records, he was Joseph's primary partner in the trafficking operation. He was killed 2 years ago when a pregnant bobcat, the animal you knew as Sierra, escaped during transport." Eleanor's stomach lurched. Escaped how? David was transferring her from a holding cage to a transport truck when she broke free. She was defending herself and her unborn young. David died from his injuries, but not before Sierra disappeared into the mountains. Agent Stonecrow paused, studying Eleanor's face. "Mrs. Whitehorse, that bobcat didn't choose your property randomly. She came here because this was the last place she remembered as safe before everything went wrong." The revelation reframed everything Eleanor thought she understood about the past months. Sierra hadn't been seeking random shelter. She'd been returning to the place where her nightmare began, trusting in some animal instinct that the widow of her captor might offer protection. The irony was devastating. Eleanor had been harboring the victim of her husband's crimes, unknowingly completing a circle of tragedy that had begun with Joseph's greed. "What about Marcus?" Eleanor asked. "What happens to him now? He'll be charged with discharge of a firearm on federal property, obstruction of a federal investigation, and animal cruelty resulting in death. His grief over his father's death doesn't excuse his actions today, but it does explain them." Agent Stonecrow closed her notebook with a snap. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I have to ask, did you have any knowledge of your husband's activities?" Eleanor met the agent's gaze steadily. "If I had known, Agent Stonecrow, do you think I would have spent months caring for one of his victims? Do you think I would have risked my freedom to protect animals he'd tortured?" The agent nodded slowly. "The evidence supports your ignorance of the operation. However, your actions over the past months, harboring protected wildlife, interfering with a federal investigation, these are still federal crimes. Eleanor had expected this moment, but hearing it spoken aloud still sent fear crawling up her spine. What kind of charges? That depends on several factors. Your cooperation with our investigation, your lack of prior knowledge, your age and circumstances. Agent Stonecrow's expression softened slightly. Mrs. Whitehorse, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen real criminals, people who traffic wildlife for profit and don't care about the suffering they cause. You're not one of them. You're a widow who found purpose in caring for animals and made some poor legal choices out of love. Eleanor felt tears threatening again. Love doesn't excuse breaking the law. No, it doesn't. But it does matter when prosecutors decide how to handle a case. Agent Stonecrow stood, gathering her materials. We'll be in touch about your testimony regarding Joseph's files. In the meantime, I'd suggest you contact an attorney. After the agent left, Eleanor wandered through her house like a ghost, touching familiar objects that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Joseph's photography awards on the mantel mocked her with their inscriptions about capturing nature's beauty. His camera equipment, which she'd handled with such reverence, seemed contaminated by the knowledge of what he'd really been documenting. The phone rang, Sarah's daily check-in right on schedule. "Mom, I heard there was some kind of federal investigation at your house. Mrs. Patterson called me. Are you all right?" Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to find words for the past week's revelations. "Your father wasn't who we thought he was, sweetheart." The silence stretched long enough that Eleanor wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah's voice returned, smaller and uncertain. "What do you mean?" "He was trafficking wildlife, selling wild animals to people who wanted to hunt them or cage them. For years, apparently." Eleanor's voice remained steady, though her hands shook. "There were federal agents here today." "They have evidence. Mom, that can't be true. Dad loved nature. He was always taking pictures of animals. He donated to wildlife organizations." "The donations were probably cover, Sarah. And the pictures weren't for art. They were documentation for buyers." Eleanor moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the deck where Sierra had died just hours earlier. "I've been living with a stranger for 50 years and never knew it." Another long silence. Then Sarah's voice thick with tears. "Mom, I'm coming home tonight. You shouldn't be alone with all this." "Sarah, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. I'll catch the red-eye from Seattle. I'll be there tomorrow morning." After hanging up, Eleanor realized she'd have to tell her children about Sierra too, about the months of secret caregiving, about watching the Bobcat die in her arms, about the federal charges she might face. Sarah and Michael would be horrified by their mother's reckless behavior, would probably use it as ammunition for their assisted living campaign. But for the first time in months, Eleanor found she didn't care about their disapproval. Caring for Sierra and her kittens had been the most meaningful thing she'd done since Joseph's death. If loving those creatures and trying to protect them was reckless, then she was proud to be reckless. As evening approached, Eleanor made a decision that would have shocked the woman she'd been that morning. She walked to Joseph's basement darkroom, the space she'd avoided for 8 months out of respect for his privacy. Using the key she'd found among his things, she unlocked the door and stepped into what she now understood was the command center of his criminal empire. The walls were covered with maps marking wildlife corridors and animal populations. File cabinets contained breeding records and transport schedules. Most damning of all, a series of photographs showed caged animals in various stages of distress, including several bobcats that looked remarkably like Sierra. One photograph stopped Eleanor cold. It showed a pregnant bobcat in a transport cage, her golden eyes wide with terror as human hands reached toward her. The timestamp indicated it was taken just days before Joseph's heart attack. Below the photo, in Joseph's handwriting, was a notation. "Premium breeding female, buyer in Nevada confirmed. Transport Tuesday." Eleanor sank into Joseph's desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his deception. Sierra's escape had probably happened during the chaos following Joseph's sudden death. David Thornfield trying to complete the transport alone, the pregnant Bobcat seizing her chance for freedom when her captor's partner collapsed. But there was something else in the photograph that made Eleanor's breath catch. In the background, barely visible, was a small placard with a number, 23. She'd seen that number before, tattooed inside Sierra's ear. Not a research facility marking, as she'd assumed, but Joseph's inventory system. Sierra had been item 23 in her husband's catalog of stolen lives. Eleanor gathered every photograph, every file, every piece of evidence that documented Joseph's crimes. Tomorrow, when Agent Stonecrow returned, she would hand over everything, not to protect herself from prosecution, but to ensure that every animal Joseph had trafficked would be accounted for, every buyer identified, every aspect of his network dismantled. It was the only justice she could offer Sierra now, the only way to honor the trust a wild mother had placed in the widow of her tormentor. As she prepared to leave the dark room, Eleanor noticed one final item, a calendar on Joseph's desk, with appointments marked in his careful handwriting. The last entry, dated 3 days before his death, simply read, "Transport complete. Nevada, buyer confirmed, $15,000. $15,000. That's what Joseph had planned to earn from selling Sierra and her unborn kittens to someone who would either hunt them for sport or cage them for entertainment. Eleanor turned off the lights and locked the dark room door, but she didn't climb the stairs immediately. She stood in the darkness of her basement, crying for the husband she'd loved and the stranger he'd actually been, for the wild mother who'd died in her arms, and for the kittens who would be euthanized because federal regulations offered no mercy for orphaned creatures whose only crime was existing in a world where humans treated living beings as commodities. Tomorrow would bring her daughter's worried questions and federal prosecutors' decisions about her fate. But tonight belonged to grief for Sierra, for innocence lost, and for the terrible knowledge that sometimes the people we love most are capable of unimaginable cruelty. 3 months later, Eleanor stood in the Colorado Wildlife Sanctuary's visitor center, surrounded by photographs that told a story of redemption she'd never imagined possible. The exhibition, titled Wild Hearts: A Love Story, drew visitors from across the state. Families with children pressed against the glass cases, wildlife enthusiasts studying her documentation of Sierra's family, and federal agents who'd become unlikely allies in her fight for justice. The centerpiece was a large photograph of Sierra nursing her kittens in the dappled sunlight beneath Eleanor's deck, their small bodies pressed trustingly against their mother's warmth. Below it, a placard read, "In memory of all wild creatures who seek only the freedom to raise their young in peace. Mrs. Whitehorse?" A young woman approached with a notebook, her press credentials identifying her as a reporter from the Denver Wildlife Journal. "I'm writing a story about your husband's trafficking network and how your testimony helped shut it down. Would you mind answering a few questions?" Eleanor nodded, though talking about Joseph's crimes still felt like swallowing broken glass. "Of course. Federal prosecutors say your cooperation was instrumental in identifying over 200 trafficked animals and shutting down the largest wildlife smuggling operation in Colorado history. How does it feel to know your husband's victims finally received justice?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. Justice seemed too clean a word for what had happened. Sierra was still dead. Her kittens, despite Eleanor's desperate legal appeals, had been euthanized as non-releasable wildlife just weeks after their mother's death. The buyers Joseph had sold animals to over the years would face fines and possible jail time, but the creatures they'd purchased were mostly beyond saving. "Justice feels incomplete when it comes after so much suffering," Eleanor said finally. "But I suppose it's better than allowing the suffering to continue." "What about Marcus Thornfield? I understand he received a suspended sentence and community service." Eleanor's relationship with Marcus had become one of the most unexpected developments of the past months. After learning the truth about his father's role in the trafficking operation, Marcus had experienced what his court-appointed therapist called a complete psychological break from his constructed reality. The man who'd shot Sierra in a fit of misguided vengeance had transformed into one of the sanctuary's most dedicated volunteers. "Marcus is here most days," Eleanor said, glancing toward the rehabilitation pens where she could see him cleaning enclosures. "He's helping care for the animals we rescued from the trafficking network. I think he's trying to atone for what both he and his father did." The reporter scribbled notes, then looked up with the carefully neutral expression journalists used when approaching sensitive topics. "There's been some controversy about your own actions, harboring protected wildlife, interfering with a federal investigation. Critics say you broke the law regardless of your intentions. How do you respond to that?" Eleanor had heard these criticisms before, mostly from online commenters who saw her story as either heartwarming or criminally irresponsible, depending on their perspective. Sarah and Michael had initially been mortified by their mother's reckless behavior, though they'd gradually come to understand her motivations. "I broke the law," Eleanor said simply. "I don't deny that or try to justify it. But if I had to do it again, knowing what I know now, I'd make the same choices. Sierra needed help, and I had the ability to provide it." Sometimes doing what's right and doing what's legal aren't the same thing. Through the visitor center's large windows, Eleanor could see the sanctuary's outdoor enclosures where rescued bobcats, foxes, and other wildlife lived out their days in as much freedom as captivity could provide. None of them could be released. Too habituated to humans, too damaged by their experiences, too old or injured to survive in the wild. But here they had space, proper care, and dignity. The reporter closed her notebook with the satisfied expression of someone who'd gotten good quotes. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Whitehorse. One last question. What do you hope people take away from your story?" Eleanor looked again at the photograph of Sierra and her kittens, remembering the weight of the camera in her hands during those precious morning observations, the way Sierra's golden eyes had seemed to hold both wildness and trust. "That love doesn't always follow the rules," she said. "And sometimes when everything else fails, it's the only thing that matters." That evening, Eleanor sat in her kitchen with her morning coffee ritual transformed into an evening reflection, looking out at the empty deck where Sierra's family had once played. The assisted living brochures had long since been thrown away. The exhibition's success had brought unexpected financial stability through print sales and speaking engagements. More importantly, it had brought purpose. Eleanor spent her days now volunteering at the sanctuary, caring for the animals rescued from trafficking operations, and speaking to school groups about the importance of protecting wildlife. At 73, she'd finally become the wildlife photographer she'd always dreamed of being, though the path had been darker and more complicated than she'd ever imagined. Sarah visited more frequently now, bringing the grandchildren to see Eleanor's exhibition and learn about their grandfather's complicated legacy. Michael had struggled more with the revelations about Joseph, but even he was beginning to understand that preserving Eleanor's independence wasn't about stubborn pride, it was about allowing an elderly woman to find meaning in her remaining years. As darkness settled over the mountains, Eleanor raised her coffee cup in a silent toast to Sierra and her kittens. Somewhere in the Colorado wilderness, other bobcat families were settling into their dens for the night, free to raise their young without human interference. It wasn't justice for Sierra, but it was hope, and sometimes, Eleanor had learned, hope was enough to build a future on. "Some families are born," she whispered to the empty deck. "Others are chosen. The best ones are rescued." In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and wild, holding space for all the creatures who asked nothing more than the chance to live free. At 73, Eleanor Whitehorse discovered that sometimes our greatest purpose comes not from what we planned, but from what breaks our hearts open. When Sierra the bobcat chose her backyard as sanctuary, Eleanor found herself caring for a wild family that transformed her grief into meaning. Like so many of us who've lost spouses and watched our children build lives far from home, Eleanor knew the ache of feeling invisible, unnecessary, forgotten by a world that no longer seemed to need what we have to offer. But in protecting Sierra and her kittens, even when it meant breaking laws and risking everything, Eleanor learned that love doesn't diminish with age. It deepens. Her story reminds us that our capacity for fierce, protective, transformative love only grows stronger with the wisdom of years. Whether it's grandchildren, rescue animals, community gardens, or mentoring young people, we all have someone or something waiting for the unique gifts that come with having lived, lost, and learned. Our so-called golden years aren't about winding down. They're about discovering what truly matters and having the courage to fight for it. Have you found unexpected purpose in caring for someone or something that needed your protection? What or who has given your life new meaning in recent years? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how you've transformed your own heartbreak into hope.